3 days before the whistle that will freeze the entire planet, the story of this World Cup is already starting to fracture in ways almost nobody expected. Back in 2018, when the United States, Canada, and Mexico stood side by side to win the right to host the 2026 World Cup, everything looked perfectly ordered, almost predetermined. The logic was simple, clean, and widely accepted without question. The United States would be the center of gravity, the economic powerhouse, the nation with the stadium scale, the broadcasting dominance, the commercial reach, and the infrastructure capable of absorbing football's biggest tournament without breaking a sweat. Canada and Mexico? They were expected to support the structure. Important, yes, but secondary. Additions to a larger American stage. That was the narrative written in advance. A script the world quietly agreed to before a single stadium was inspected or a single fan had booked a flight. In that version of reality, the story of the 2026 World Cup would be told through Los Angeles lights, Dallas crowds, New York noise, and the relentless machinery of American sport entertainment. Everything else, Toronto, Mexico City, Guadalajara, was supposed to sit slightly to the side of the main event, important but ultimately peripheral. The opening chapters of a book that belonged, unquestionably, to the United States. But 8 years later, as the opening ceremonies approach and the world prepares to step into the tournament, that certainty no longer feels as solid. Not because the United States has failed to build what it promised. In fact, the opposite is true. The stadiums are almost unreal in scale. SoFi in Los Angeles rises like a piece of the future itself, engineered for spectacle. Dallas, New Jersey, Seattle. Each venue stands as proof that the infrastructure dream was fully delivered. On paper, everything is in place. The machine is ready. The broadcast networks are aligned. The global audience will be larger than almost anything football has ever produced. And yet, something subtle but unmistakable is shifting in the space around it. Between the structures and the people. Between expectation and experience. Between what was planned and what is now beginning to unfold. Because as the tournament edges closer, Canada and Mexico are no longer standing in the background of this story. They are stepping forward into it. Because what has unfolded in the build-up is not a single dramatic twist, it is a series of quiet, compounding shifts that only become visible when you step back far enough to see the pattern forming. Nowhere is that clearer than in the opening ceremonies. For years, the expectation was that the United States would define the cultural face of this tournament. And on paper, that expectation still looks intact. The Los Angeles ceremony at SoFi Stadium is stacked with global names, engineered for maximum reach, designed to speak to every continent at once. Katy Perry headlining. K-pop presence through Lisa of Blackpink. A fusion of Afrobeats, Latin pop, and global mainstream artists built into a single 13-minute spectacle. It is polished. It is massive. It is undeniably global in its ambition. The kind of production only a country with America's entertainment industry could assemble at this scale. But when you place it beside what Mexico has done, something else becomes visible. Not louder, not necessarily bigger, but deeper in a different direction. At the Azteca Stadium, on the eve of the tournament, Mexico did not assemble a global showcase. It assembled something closer to identity itself. Shakira and Burna Boy standing not as detached international icons, but as anchors of a musical moment tied directly to football's emotional memory. Maná on stage not as an imported act, but as a living piece of Mexico's cultural backbone. Los Angeles Azules bringing a sound that does not represent Mexico from the outside, it is Mexico, shaped over generations. Lila Downs, Alejandro Fernandez, J Balvin, each name not selected to symbolize diversity, but to reflect something already embedded in the country's cultural bloodstream. And that difference matters in ways that cannot be measured in production budgets or global reach statistics. One ceremony feels assembled for the world. The other feels rooted in place and then offered to the world from there. Then there is Canada, quieter in scale but precise in intent. Toronto's opening ceremony does not try to compete in spectacle. It leans into recognition. Michael Bublé and Alanis Morissette standing on home soil, not as global exports performing for validation, but as cultural figures returning to the place that shaped them. There is a simplicity to it that feels almost disarming in contrast to the layered global production elsewhere. And yet, that simplicity carries its own weight, an honesty about what Canada is bringing into this tournament, not excess, but clarity. And slowly, without announcement or official declaration, that contrast begins to reshape perception. Not through marketing, not through slogans, but through atmosphere. Because before a single ball is kicked, the emotional tone of a World Cup is already being written, not only by who hosts the matches, but by how those hosts choose to present themselves to the world. And in that silent competition, Mexico and Canada have begun to occupy space that was never formally assigned to them. And that shift becomes even more visible when the tournament moves away from ceremonies and into something far more revealing, the lived experience of fans. Because this is where World Cups are no longer defined by presentations or announcements, but by atmosphere. By whether people show up without being asked twice. By whether a city feels like it is hosting a global event, or whether it feels like the event has already become part of the city's bloodstream. In Mexico, that answer appears almost immediately. Football there does not need to be introduced, explained, or marketed. It already exists in the public space, long before FIFA arrives. The Zócalo in Mexico City doesn't transform into a fan zone, it simply becomes a larger version of what it already is, a gathering point for a country that lives its football emotionally, daily, instinctively. Free entry, open screens, music, movement, celebration stretching across 39 days without interruption. Not because demand had to be created, but because demand was never in question. In Guadalajara, in Monterrey, in every space where a screen lights up, the pattern repeats itself. Crowds don't form, they reform, as if the tournament is simply giving shape to something already present. There is a kind of inevitability to it. As if Mexico is not hosting the World Cup, but revealing how it has always been hosting football in its own way, long before the world arrived to notice. Canada tells a different story, but one that is just as intentional. Instead of concentrating energy into a few major cities, it spreads the experience outward. Canada Celebrates becomes less of an event structure and more of a national network. Small cities, large cities, remote communities, each given access within reach. Not everyone flies to Toronto or Vancouver. Instead, the tournament comes closer to them. Screens in public squares, parks, community centers. A distributed celebration across a country that understands its geography is too vast for centralization, and its football culture too diverse for a single focal point. And when the matches arrive in Toronto and Vancouver, something else emerges, the density effect. Smaller capacities, tighter environments, closer sound, less distance between pitch and crowd. The kind of atmosphere where noise doesn't spread out, it compresses. Meanwhile, in the United States, a different tension starts to appear in the same space. Not absence of infrastructure, there is no question about that. The stadiums are monumental. The scale is unmatched. But the fan layer around them begins to feel less consistent. Some planned festival spaces shrink or disappear. Some projections of attendance soften under revised expectations. Travel complexity, pricing pressure, and international hesitation begin to shape a quieter undercurrent beneath the surface of what was meant to be an overwhelming arrival of global supporters. And so a contrast forms, not dramatic, not absolute, but increasingly visible. In Mexico and Canada, the tournament feels absorbed into life. In parts of the United States, it still feels assembled around it. And as that difference settles in, a more uncomfortable question begins to surface underneath everything else. And that question becomes unavoidable the closer we get to kickoff. Where does a World Cup actually live? Inside its stadiums, or inside the feeling it creates outside them? Because by the time the final preparations are complete, the tournament is no longer just a logistical masterpiece spread across 3 nations. It has become something more fragile than that, a battle of atmosphere, identity, and emotional ownership. The United States still holds the structural center of gravity. That has never changed. The biggest stadiums are there. The final is there. The broadcast reach, the commercial scale, the global attention, those remain anchored in American soil. When the knockout rounds begin, when the stakes rise and the world narrows its focus onto the decisive matches, it is inevitable that the most watched moments will unfold in American venues built for spectacle on an almost unmatched scale. And yet, by the time those moments arrive, the story the world is carrying with it will already have been shaped elsewhere. Because Mexico enters this tournament not as a host discovering football, but as a nation where football already defines rhythm, identity, and emotion. Every match played at the Azteca carries not just home advantage, but historical weight. Decades of expectation compressed into 90 minutes at altitude, inside one of the most mythologized stadiums in the sport's history. It is not just hosting games. It is reliving them through a national memory that never stopped building. And Canada, quieter but no less significant, steps into something entirely new, its first men's World Cup matches on home soil. That alone changes everything. There is no established script, no inherited pressure of dominance, only the raw presence of a country meeting its own football identity in real time. Every cheer in Toronto, every roar in Vancouver, is part of something still being written rather than repeated. So what emerges is not a simple hierarchy of hosts, but a split identity tournament. One part built on scale, infrastructure, and global reach. Another part built on immediacy, culture, and emotional density. And in that split, the narrative does not remain fixed where it was originally designed in 2018. It moves. Not away from the United States, but alongside it. Because by the time the final whistle of this World Cup is blown on July 19th, the question will not be which country hosted it best in a technical sense. It will be which country made it feel alive the most consistently, the most visibly, the most unforgettably. And that answer may not belong to only one nation. If you want, I can next.